Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are wading into some really deep water here. We're looking at one of these most, I think it's fair to say, polarizing and just incredibly emotionally charged criminal cases in recent American history. The 2008 death of 2-year-old Caylee Anthony and, of course, the trial of her mother, Caylee Anthony.
Yeah, this is a really crucial deep dive because when you look at the sources, it's not just a timeline of events. It's layers upon layers of conflicting forensic claims, some pretty significant procedural issues, errors even, and just this unprecedented wave of public fury. I mean, this case really defined what we now call the social media trial.
Absolutely. And our mission today, let's be clear, it's not to retry Caylee Anthony. It's not to pass judgment. We're aiming to be sort of clinical guides through this. We want to extract the verifiable facts, look closely at those really technical, disputed forensic points, and synthesize the two, radically different stories that emerged. One was calculated cold-blooded murder, the other accidental death, followed by a really pathological, complex cover-up. We want to give you, the listener, a clear, non-judgmental synthesis of why that final verdict landed the way it did, why it was so shocking and, frankly, divisive.
Exactly. We're going to break down the timeline, the evidence, both circumstantial and that very disputed forensic stuff. We'll look at the defense's strategy, which was, well, explosive and very calculated. And then the verdict itself and the legal and social fallout that's still felt today. I think we need to understand not just what the evidence was, but also why so much of it just didn't meet that incredibly high bar of proof beyond a reasonable doubt in the jury's eyes.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this whole thing. We should probably start right at the beginning, right? The family context and that moment that deception really began.
Okay, so the story starts in Orlando, Florida. And it's a pretty classic multi-generational household setup. You've got Caylee Marie Anthony, born August 2005. She's living there with her mom, Casey Marie Anthony, and her maternal grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony. And this, closeness of family life, it kind of ironically becomes the backdrop for this huge, massive deception that unfolds.
Right, and the chain of events that the prosecution later really hammered on for their motive argument, it kicks off on June 16th, 2008. Casey leaves the family home. She gives her mother, Cindy, a very specific story. She says she's taking Caylee to her nanny, Zanny Fernandez-Gonzalez, and then she herself is off to Tampa for a work trip.
And Cindy accepts this explanation, and that leads to this huge, absolutely fateful 31-day gap. For over a month, Casey basically keeps up this fiction. Caylee's with Zanny, they're away, Caylee's fine, everything's okay.
Until Cindy Anthony finally breaks that cycle. On July 15, 2008, so 31 days after Casey left, Cindy makes this really desperate 911 call. Our sources say she told the dispatcher that Casey had given her all these varied, contradictory, just constantly shifting stories about where Caylee was before finally admitting she hadn't actually seen her daughter in weeks.
And then Casey herself makes a second call to law enforcement, a distinct call. And this is where she dramatically escalates things. She falsely claims Caylee was kidnapped by this nanny, Zenaida Fernandez-Gonzalez, supposedly back on June 9th. I mean, this wasn't just a little white lie. This was the immediate construction of this grand, complex, totally imaginary kidnapping scenario involving someone who, well, didn't actually exist in that role at all.
Yeah, the sheer audacity, right?
Yeah.
Sustaining that kind of lie for 31 days. That immediately raised massive red flags for investigators. And during that 31-day window, another really disturbing piece of evidence surfaces. Casey's car.
Yes, the car. Casey's Pontiac Sunfire is found abandoned. It gets towed. George Anthony goes to recover it. And both he and the manager at the tow yard report this strong, really unmistakable smell. A smell they both immediately identified as human decomposition, coming from the trunk. The trunk itself, almost empty, just a bag of trash inside.
That odor, that's one of the earliest and you'd think most critical pieces of circumstantial evidence connecting Casey to, well, the disposal of a body. Yeah. But even this key detail ended up being disputed later on, didn't it?
It did, that's right. Our sources note that Cindy Anthony, who initially told the 911 operator the car smelled like a dead body had been in it. Later during the trial, she actually retracted that specific claim. She testified she used that phrase, smelled like a dead body, more as a figure of speech and exaggeration. She claimed she only said it to try and spur the police into urgent action because she thought they wouldn't take a missing toddler report seriously otherwise. And that retraction, well, it immediately weakened the impact of that odor evidence for the prosecution.
Wow. Okay, so the investigation kicks off right after that missing person report. It's rapid, and it immediately starts exposing Casey's, pattern of lying. Pathological is the word often used. She gets arrested the very next day, July 16th, 2008.
Yeah, and the list of lies just right off the bat is pretty extensive. Police quickly figure out Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez is basically a ghost. The apartment Casey pointed to as the nanny's, it had been abandoned for over 140 days. Then there's the job lie. Casey claimed she worked at Universal Studios. Investigators actually take her there, ask her, okay, show us your office. And Casey actually leads the detectives into the building before finally breaking down and admitting she hadn't worked there in nearly 3 years, not since she took maternity leave.
That specific moment leading detectives into the place she falsely claimed to work, before finally admitting the whole elaborate lie that became the foundation for the prosecution's picture of Casey's character, right? Someone who lied quickly, dramatically, constantly, just to avoid any kind of responsibility. And that pattern of behavior became absolutely key to the motive they proposed later.
So Casey's arrested. The search for Caylee intensifies, but the actual discovery of her remains. It's marked by some really frustrating delays and, frankly, missed opportunities, which is a major procedural issue we really need to talk about.
Yeah, this involves the meter reader Roy Kronk, starting back between August 11th and 13th, 2008. Now remember, while Caylee is still officially missing, Casey's been arrested. Kronk calls the police multiple times. He's seen something suspicious, a gray bag and what looks like a skull in a wooded area right near the Anthony house.
And this is really where the system kind of failed initially. Our sources show Kronk was first directed to, like, a non-urgent tip line. And even though an officer was eventually dispatched, that officer did a pretty cursory search, reported seeing nothing. So a potentially crucial discovery gets delayed by 4 months because of this breakdown in police procedure and follow-up.
It's not until December 11th, 2008, when Kronk calls the police again, insistent, that they finally search that area properly. And that's when they find Caylee's skeletal remains, inside a trash bag, along with a blanket, in that wooded, kind of swampy area, very close to the family home.
And the state of the remains, how they were found, it immediately raises the stakes. That duct tape they found, that becomes the single most critical and most contested piece of physical evidence for the state. What were the specifics on that? Because the reports were a bit conflicting, weren't they?
They were slightly inconsistent, yeah. And that inconsistency, as we'll see, really helped create that reasonable doubt later. Some of the initial reports said the duct tape was found near the front of the skull, but other, more alarming initial reports stated it was found on the mouth of the skull, and that it was actually hanging from hair still attached to the skull. I mean, the implication, if it really was placed over the mouth, well, it's obvious. Suffocation.
So after the recovery, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Jan Garavalia, confirms the remains are Caylee's. That's on December 19th, 2008. The death is officially ruled a homicide, meaning, death caused by another person. But, and this is the absolute major sticking point, the piece of legal precision that just blew the whole case wide open, the cause of death, was listed as undetermined.
Yeah, that phrase, homicide by undetermined means, that is absolutely paramount. It means the medical examiner was sure someone else caused Caylee's death, but they couldn't definitively say how. No bullet hole, no clear sign of blunt force trauma, no definitive forensic sign of strangulation. So without a definite cause of death, the prosecution's entire case had to rely on this really complex web of motive and circumstantial evidence.
Precisely. That gap in the forensic findings, that undetermined, it created the entire battlefield for the trial. And it resulted in these two narratives that were so dramatically opposed, they hardly seemed to belong to the same universe, let alone the same case.
Okay, let's detail the prosecution's theory first. What was their argument for how and why this happened?
The prosecution alleged premeditated first-degree murder. Their theory was that Casey used chloroform to incapacitate Caylee. Chloroform being a chemical they later tried very hard to link to Casey's car and to computer searches made on the family computer. They argued that after incapacitating her, Casey then applied duct tape over Caylee's nose and mouth, causing suffocation. And their proposed motive. It was simple and pretty dark. Casey wanted to be free from the responsibilities of being a mother so she could live this carefree life of partying, dating, no strings attached.
And the defense, led by Jose Baez, countered with something just explosive, shocking. It shifted the blame completely away from Casey's intent, didn't it? And pointed the finger squarely at her father, George.
Yeah. The defense claimed Caylee's death wasn't murder at all. It was a tragic accident. An accidental drowning in the family swimming pool back on June 16, 2008, the very day Casey claimed she was leaving with Caylee. And then came the really devastating part of their claim, that George Anthony found the body. And with Casey's eventual knowledge, he disposed of it to cover up the accident, terrified of potential child neglect charges, maybe worse. They even added another layer, alleging Casey's subsequent behavior, the constant lying, the erratic actions, were defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
Rooted, they claimed, in childhood sexual abuse she'd allegedly suffered from both her father, George, and her brother, Lee.
The sheer maybe audacity or maybe legal brilliance of that defense move is hard to overstate. By throwing out the drowning scenario, they weren't necessarily asking the jury to believe George did it right. They were just creating what the law calls a reasonable hypothesis of innocence, something plausible that countered the state's premeditation theory. They basically weaponized that undetermined cause of death finding.
So the charges Casey faced were incredibly serious. First-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter, plus those 4 counts of lying to police. And the state was seeking the death penalty. Now, because of the intense, truly unprecedented media frenzy surrounding this case, finding impartial jurors locally in Orlando was deemed impossible. So the court took this extraordinary step. They selected the jury way over in Pinellas County, that's Clearwater, and then those jurors were completely sequestered, cut off from outside influence for the entire 6-week trial back in Orlando.
The opening statements immediately set the stage for this huge clash. Prosecutor Linda Burdick's laid out the state's narrative, calculated murder using chloroform, duct tape. Then Jose Baez gets up and just drops the bombshell. Accidental drowning, cover up by George Anthony. Introducing a third-party culprit, a non-homicidal cause of death. It immediately muddied the waters on that crucial issue of intent.
Absolutely. And what followed was 6 weeks dominated by really complex circumstantial evidence, much of which was highly technical, scientific, and ultimately successfully branded by the defense as fantasy forensics. Pieces of prosecution evidence, but focus on how the defense managed to chip away at them, creating that doubt.
Okay, let's start with the smell. That decomposition odor George Anthony reported in the car. The prosecution leaned heavily on this, right? But then Casey's boyfriend at the time testified he did not smell it. So, immediate conflict there. Crucially, though, 2 police dog handlers testified their specially trained cadaver dogs did alert. One alerted specifically to the trunk of Casey's car, and a different dog alerted to the backyard of the Anthony home.
Right. That dog evidence sounds powerful, and it is compelling, but legally, it's still circumstantial. It doesn't prove how Caylee died or who killed her. The prosecution desperately needed direct proof of the murder method, the chloroform and duct tape theory, and they thought they had a smoking gun with the computer search history. A software forensic expert, John Dennis Bradley, initially testified that the word chloroform had been searched an astonishing 84 times on the Anthony family computer. 84 times. That strongly suggests premeditation, right? Researching how to use it.
84 searches. Wow. Yeah, that sounds like clear evidence of someone planning something nefarious. But hold on, this is where that forensic evidence became, well, shockingly unreliable, isn't it?
This is where it gets really, really interesting and honestly pretty devastating for the prosecution's case. After the trial was over, Bradley publicly retracted that testimony. He explained there was a software bug, an error in the forensic tool he used for the examination. He confirmed the computer actually only contained 1 single search for chloroform, not 84, just 1. A single search which, as we'll get to, the defense later managed to pin on Casey's mother, Cindy. So the prosecution's core evidence for premeditation, those 84 searches, fundamentally gutted by a software bug.
Wow. That single detail, a software glitch, reducing 84 potential acts of murder prep down to 1 possibly innocent search, there's just monumental. Did the prosecution ever really recover from that blow, having their main premeditation evidence just evaporate?
They really struggled. They had to pivot hard back to the other circumstantial evidence, like the trace chemicals. Dr. Garavaglia, the medical examiner, she maintained her opinion. It was homicide. Based on how the body was found, the duct tape, and other circumstantial factors, like trace amounts of chloroform found in the car's trunk lining. But under intense cross-examination by Baez, she had to concede a critical point. The toxicology tests run directly on Caylee's skeletal remains came back negative for any volatile chemicals. So no chemical residue found on the bones themselves, no clear, definitive forensic link on the victim to back up that chloroform suffocation theory.
That lack of definitive chemical proof on the remains must have given the defense tremendous leverage. Okay, let's move to the other really big piece of physical evidence. The duct tape.
Right. The state called Michael Warren, a director at a human identification lab. He presented this computer animation overlaying Caylee's skull with the position of the duct tape, and he gave his expert opinion. The tape was placed prior to decomposition, meaning on a recently deceased or possibly even dying child. Then, adding this highly emotional but visually unproven detail, an FBI examiner named Elizabeth Fontaine testified. She claimed she could see the faint outline of a heart-shaped sticker on the surface of the duct tape. The implication being, a sticker maybe Caylee had put there or Casey had, linking it personally. But crucially, Fontaine admitted the outline wasn't clear enough to be captured in a photograph.
That sounds exactly like the kind of testimony designed purely for emotional impact on the jury, doesn't it? Especially given the lack of actual photographic proof. It's precisely the kind of thing the defense later labeled phantom evidence.
Absolutely. And another piece of highly complex, contested forensic evidence involved a single hair found in the trunk of Casey's car. An FBI hair analyst, Sebastian Shaw, testified the hair belonged to Caylee. Okay. But he also testified it shades something called root banding. Shaw claimed, based on an expedited study he was conducting at the time, that this type of banding occurred post-mortem, after death. He was trying to use this to scientifically link Caylee's dead body back to being inside that trunk, but the defense naturally attacked the validity and the scientific acceptance of Shaw's specific expedited study. It wasn't widely established science.
And finally, perhaps the most experimental and controversial testimony came from Dr. Arpad Vas, didn't it? The air sampling.
Yes, Dr. Vass from Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He reported that he conducted air sampling tests inside the trunk of Casey's car, and his procedure indicated the presence of compounds associated with human decomposition and also chloroform in the air trapped in the trunk. Now, the defense objected vehemently to this testimony. Why? Because this specific air sampling technique, sometimes called vapor headspace analysis, it was a forensic method that had never been admitted as evidence in a criminal court case before, ever. It lacked sufficient peer review validation in this specific legal context. Its scientific reliability was highly questionable, making it relatively easy for the jury to disregard.
Okay, so if the prosecution's evidence felt like a house of cards built on faulty software, novel techniques that hadn't been validated, conflicting testimony, phantom stickers, let's look at how the defense, through their own witnesses and rebuttals, really drove home that idea of reasonable doubt.
The defense brought in their own heavy hitters. Most notably, the renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz. He directly attacked Dr. Garavalia's work. He called her autopsy shoddy, specifically for failing to open Caylee's skull during the examination, which, he argued, was an unusual omission in such a complex potential homicide case. And even more powerfully, he directly countered the state's timeline regarding the duct tape. Dr. Spitz argued the tape was placed post-decomposition after the flesh was gone. And critically, he testified that if the tape had been placed directly on skin, as the prosecution implied for suffocation, it absolutely should have retained residual DNA from skin cells. And no such DNA was found on the tape.
The family members themselves also became key defense witnesses, right? Cindy Anthony provided that alternative explanation for the single chloroform search. It sounds like the defense was just throwing every possible non-murder explanation against the wall. Did the jury really buy that claim about mistyping chloroform when searching for chlorophyll?
Whether every single juror bought it, hook, line, and sinker is debatable. But legally, it served the defense's purpose perfectly. It introduced a plausible, alternative, non-homicidal explanation for what had initially seemed like damning premeditation evidence. Cindy also offered an explanation for the other items found with the remains: the blanket, the plastic bags, the duct tape. She testified the family routinely buried their deceased pets using exactly those materials. Wrapped in a blanket, put in plastic bags, sealed with duct tape. Again, neutralizing the circumstantial link between those items and a human murder.
And then came the testimony that directly targeted George Anthony's credibility.
Yes. The defense called a volunteer searcher named Crystal Holloway. She testified she'd had an affair with George Anthony during the time Caylee was missing. And crucially, she claimed George had told her Caylee's death was an accident that snowballed out of control. Now, George vehemently denied the affair, and he denied making that full statement, claiming Holloway had twisted his words. The judge had to give the jury very specific instructions here. Holloway's testimony was only admissible to potentially impeach George's credibility, basically, to suggest he might be lying about certain things. It was not direct evidence proving how Caylee died. But, the seed of doubt about George's potential role or his honesty had been firmly planted in the jurors' minds.
So the closing arguments then had to try and tie this mountain of confusing, conflicting information together for the jury. How did each side wrap up?
Prosecutor Jeff Ashton went back to the motive. Casey wanted to party, be free. He argued it was absurd to think someone would make an accidental drowning look exactly like a deliberate murder with duct tape. He relentlessly hammered on Casey's documented history of expensive, elaborate lying.
And the defense closing, led by Baez and J. Cheney Mason.
Pure strategic focus on the law and the burden of proof. Baez attacked the circumstantial nature of the whole case, famously dismissing the state's key points as fantasy searches, fantasy forensics, phantom stickers. Mason followed up, really emphasizing the prosecution's burden. He argued the state had absolutely failed to eliminate that reasonable hypothesis of innocence, which the defense maintained was the accidental drowning scenario.
And the prosecution's final rebuttal. That was designed to be emotionally devastating, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. Prosecutor Linda Burdick, in her final words to the jury, showed them a striking side-by-side image. On one side, a photo of Casey partying, smiling, seemingly carefree during the time Caylee was missing. On the other, a photo of a new tattoo Casey got just days before Caylee was reported missing. The tattoo read Bella Vita, Italian for beautiful life. It was a direct, powerful visual appeal, trying to link Casey's seemingly flippant, self-absorbed actions directly to her guilt.
So just to recap the evidence the jury had, one computer search, later explained away, an unproven, novel air sampling technique, conflicting testimony about a smell, duct tape testimony that was inconsistent, a heart sticker nobody could photograph. The jury was basically left with this collection of highly suspect circumstantial pieces, very little concrete proof, which leads us directly to the verdict.
Right. The jury goes into deliberations, and here's a really critical footnote to the trial itself. They delivered their verdict on July 5th, 2011, but apparently the prosecution team was actually preparing to go back to the judge and jury that day to give them the corrected information about the computer search discrepancy. To tell them officially it was one search, not 84, due to the software error, but the jury came back with the verdict before the prosecutors got the chance to make that correction.
Wow. Okay, so the verdict comes in, and it sends an immediate shockwave across the entire country. Caylee Anthony is found not guilty of the most serious charges. Not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated manslaughter, and not guilty of aggravated child abuse. She was found guilty on 4 lesser counts, misdemeanor counts of providing false information to law enforcement.
Yeah, those 4 specific misdemeanor counts related directly to lies she told investigators early on. Lying about working at Universal Studios. Lying about employing the non-existent nanny, Zanny. Lying to her coworkers that Caylee had disappeared. And lying about having spoken to Caylee after the child had already gone missing.
Okay, so guilty on the lying charges. She was sentenced to 1 year in jail for each count, served consecutively, so 4 years total. That was the maximum penalty for those misdemeanors. But because she'd already spent so long in jail awaiting trial, she'd been incarcerated since October 2008, she was credited with time served. And she was released just 10 days after the verdict, on July 17th, 2011.
The interviews with the jurors after the trial are absolutely essential to understanding why they reached that verdict. They consistently emphasized they were legally bound to rely only on the evidence presented in court, not on public opinion, not on media coverage, not even on their own personal gut feelings or suspicions. And they concluded, based on that evidence, that the state had failed to prove the specific cause of death, and failed, critically, to prove the required intent for first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt.
Right. One juror, Jennifer Ford, she really stressed that fundamental legal principle they had to uphold. Their job wasn't to find Caylee innocent. Their job was only to find her not guilty if the prosecution hadn't met its burden of proof. The jury foreman also elaborated later. He said the state's proposed motives that Caylee killed her daughter just so she could go party felt, in his words, kinda weak. And he admitted that the doubt raised about George Anthony's potential role in a cover-up definitely factored into their inability to reach unanimous certainty about Caylee's guilt for murder.
And that internal conflict, that doubt, it clearly lingered for some of them. Our sources show that in 2021, a full decade after the verdict, one male juror stated publicly he actually regretted his vote to fully acquit on the homicide charges. He said that looking back, based on the evidence of neglect and the circumstances, he probably would have convicted her of aggravated manslaughter and aggravated child abuse. Hindsight is 2020, I guess.
Wow. Okay, now let's pivot to the media explosion. Because this case wasn't just news, it was a national obsession. Unlike almost anything since maybe the O.J. Simpson trial, Time magazine literally called it the social media trial of the century.
Yeah, and certain television personalities, most notably Nancy Grace on HLN, arguably turned this from a local Florida homicide case into a national fever pitch. Grace constantly referred to Caylee as the tot mom. She made her personal belief in Caylee's guilt incredibly clear night after night. She essentially manufactured this national narrative of a guilty mother. And it worked in terms of ratings. That coverage drove HLN to record numbers. They peak at something like 5.2 million viewers tuning in live just to hear the verdict read.
When that verdict came back not guilty on the major charges, the public reaction was just explosive fury. Social media, Facebook, Twitter, still relatively new platforms, and just surged to traffic, outrage, disbelief. And many people immediately made that comparison, calling it OJ #2. It felt like the legal system had failed, had betrayed the narrative the media had built.
Analysts who looked at this public outrage afterwards noted a really clear gender gap in the polling data. A USA Today Gallup poll found women were significantly more likely than men to believe Caylee had actually committed murder, something like 28% of women versus only 11% of men. Women were also much more likely to express anger about the verdict, and analysts partly linked this to, the perceived violation of that deeply ingrained cultural ideal of the maternal instinct. The idea of a mother killing her own child felt like such an unthinkable betrayal that it generated this disproportionate fury, particularly among women.
Okay, so the trial's over, Caylee's released, but the legal drama wasn't quite finished, was it? She appealed those misdemeanor convictions for lying to the police.
She did, and she was actually partially successful based on a fundamental legal principle. A Florida appellate court later overturned 2 of her 4 misdemeanor convictions. The grounds. Double jeopardy. This is really valuable legal information here. The court ruled that making multiple false statements during one single continuous police interview constitutes only one criminal offense, not multiple separate offenses for each lie told within that interview. So they essentially said you can't be punished multiple times for the same criminal act of lying during one interrogation. That reduced her convictions from 4 misdemeanors down to 2.
Interesting. So lie 4 times in one continuous session. Legally, it's one crime, not 4 separate ones. That's a key legal takeaway from that post-trial ruling. Now, beyond the criminal appeals, Caylee also faced some major financial and civil consequences, right?
Oh, definitely. She was ordered by the court to pay the state of Florida about $217,000. That was to reimburse the state for the investigative costs they incurred just during that initial phase, between the missing persons report being filed and the official homicide probe opening. Of course, she ended up filing for bankruptcy in 2013. She claimed estimated liabilities up to $1 million, showing just the massive personal financial cost of this whole protracted legal nightmare for her.
And she was also sued civilly, wasn't she, by some of the people whose names she dragged through the mud, like the woman she falsely accused of being the nanny, Zenaida Fernandez-Gonzalez, and Roy Crunk, the meter reader.
Yes, both sued her for defamation. And the outcomes of those suits are actually quite telling about how the law views intent. Both lawsuits, Fernandez-Gonzalez's was dismissed in 2015, Crunk's in 2019 were ultimately thrown out. In both cases, the courts basically found that while Caylee's statements about them were certainly false, there wasn't enough evidence to prove she had the specific willful intent required to meet the legal standard for defamation under Florida law. It's almost like the court saw her lying as so pervasive, so pathological, that it couldn't necessarily be proven she intentionally set out with malice to ruin these specific individuals' reputations. It's a weird legal distinction. Oh, and Texas EquiSearch, the volunteer search group. They also sued her for fraud, claiming they spent over $100,000 searching for Caylee based on Caylee's lies while knowing Caylee was already dead. They eventually settled for $75,000, though realistically, given her bankruptcy, they probably expected to receive very little, if any, of that money.
Then in 2016, there was another layer of controversy. Some pretty scandalous allegations surfaced in affidavits filed by a private investigator, Dominic Casey.
Right. Dominic Casey had briefly worked for the defense team. He filed these affidavits, which were later struck from the record or sealed by the court, making some explosive claims. He alleged that defense attorney Jose Baez had told him, Dominic Casey, that Caylee Anthony had admitted to killing her daughter. He also alleged that Baez had engaged in a sexual relationship with Caylee Anthony during the trial prep. Baez immediately and vehemently denied both claims, calling them 100% false. And as I said, the court ultimately struck or sealed those affidavits, likely due to their unsubstantiated nature and potential to prejudice any future proceedings.
Okay, shifting gears to the legislative impact. That intense public anger after the acquittal really fueled movements across the country for something called Caylee's Law, right?
Yes, Caylee's Law was basically the public outcry being translated into proposed legislation in many states. The core idea was to impose stricter, mandatory, timely reporting requirements on parents or legal guardians if a child goes missing, often proposing something like a 24-hour deadline to notify law enforcement. It gained massive grassroots support online, driven by that public anger. But critics raised valid concerns. They argued that these kinds of reactive laws, born from one specific, highly unusual case, could lead to unintended consequences. Like overcompliance, parents calling police immediately for any minor delay, generating false reports, and potentially misdirecting already strained police resources away from genuine critical emergencies.
And some crucial information also came to light after the trial, information that seemed to fundamentally contradict parts of the timeline presented in court. In 2012, reports surfaced revealing the police had apparently failed to properly investigate the Firefox browser history on Casey's password-protected computer account. What did that hidden history supposedly show?
This was another potentially stunning revelation because it went right back to the cause of death question. This separate browser history, logged under Casey's specific user account, reportedly showed a search for foolproof suffocation, made at 2:51 p.m. on June 16th. Now, why is that time significant? Because it was after George Anthony claimed Casey had already left the house with Caylee, he said around 12:50 p.m., and this search was apparently followed by activity on Casey's MySpace and Facebook accounts, suggesting she was actively online hours later than the timeline George provided. I mean, that foolproof suffocation search, if it had been found and admitted during the trial, could have been incredibly powerful evidence supporting the prosecution's premeditation and suffocation theory, evidence the jury never heard.
And the ultimate sort of twist in this ongoing saga is that Caylee Anthony herself keeps reemerging into the public eye, often with new and usually controversial claims.
Yeah, she seems unable to stay completely out of the spotlight. In 2022, she participated in a Peacock documentary series about her case. In it, she discussed her life, reiterated her claims of alleged sexual abuse by her father and brother, arguing her pathological lying was essentially a learned defense mechanism from that trauma. She also made this highly controversial, and frankly quite recent, claim that her pregnancy with Caylee itself was a result of her being drugged and raped when she was 18. Her narrative, whenever she speaks, consistently paints her as the victim of circumstances, of her family, of the media, never as the perpetrator.
And most recently, in what seems like a truly bizarre attempt at public image rehabilitation. In March 2025, Caylee Anthony announced she was launching a new career path, positioning herself as a legal advocate, using platforms like TikTok and an email newsletter, apparently aiming to, quote, refine her public image and advocate for various communities, including somehow advocating for her deceased daughter, Caylee. It's quite something. Hashtag, tag, tag, outro.
You know, looking back at this entire deep dive, it really feels like the most impactful factor in the final outcome wasn't necessarily the evidence itself or lack thereof. It was the massive, overwhelming public reaction to the perceived failure of the justice system, a failure to deliver the clear conviction that the media, especially figures like Nancy Grace, had all but promised the public was coming. That intense public focus, that certainty of guilt fostered by the media, it truly overshadowed the fundamental bedrock legal requirement for proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, this case is so often brought up as a textbook example of the CSI effect.
Yeah.
The idea that jurors, maybe subconsciously influenced by slick TV crime dramas, come into court expecting definitive, conclusive forensic evidence in every single case.
Yeah.
Perfect DNA matches, clear fingerprints on the weapon, unambiguous chemical residue. And that expectation really challenged the prosecutors here because they were forced to rely so heavily on circumstantial evidence that proved vulnerable to the defense's relentless strategy of poking holes and introducing reasonable doubt.
And that crucial strategic loophole created by the medical examiner's finding of an undetermined cause of death, that's what allowed the defense to so effectively shift the narrative. To pivot from the state's story of clear murderous intent to this alternative possibility of a tragic accident followed by a panicked cover-up. Many legal experts who observed the trial suggested afterwards that the jury might have interpreted reasonable doubt perhaps far too stringently, demanding almost absolute certainty from the state, which is rarely achievable in complex circumstantial cases.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. Marcia Clark, who famously prosecuted the O.J. Simpson trial, she once pointed out that some legal systems, like Scotland's for example, actually have three possible verdicts: guilty, not guilty, and a third option, not proven. Also, considering the Anthony jury's clear emotional conflict, the state's devastating inability to definitively prove how Caylee died, and that massive cloud of reasonable doubt the defense managed to create. Where do you think the truth of this verdict ultimately landed? Was it a finding of true innocence, or was it simply fundamentally a case that was just not proven?